For decades, it was treated as dead space, an empty cavity beneath Berlin that survived the last shelling but supposedly held nothing worth keeping. The place sits under a service yard near the Spree, close enough to the government quarter that it could be reached on foot far enough to be written off as infrastructure. On paper, it was ordinary, a wartime utility corridor tied to rail maintenance, ventilation shafts, and emergency power. In April 1945, as the city folded in on itself, German crews sealed several access points with poured concrete and steel doors taken from an air raid shelter. In the first weeks after the surrender, Soviet engineers cataloged the entrances, marked the location on a grid map, and listed the site as cleared. By the early 1950s, it was closed again, officially for safety, then forgotten outside a few technical files. One line in a short Allied field report doesn't match that calm story. It mentions a secondary room behind the utility corridor with a double-layered door assembly, an outer steel slab, and an inner panel faced with a pale ceramic tile, fitted into a frame that looked factory-made rather than improvised. The report notes that the hinges were oversized for the door's thickness, and that the latch side carried bolt holes as if something heavier had once been mounted there. No weapons cache is listed, no radios, no medical supplies, just that door, described and then left behind in the paperwork like an uncomfortable detail. Later summaries of the same site omit the sentence entirely. The map references remain, but the passage about the secondary room doesn't reappear even when the corridor itself is discussed. No correction is offered, no explanation, no follow-up inspection noted in open records, only the quiet disappearance of a description that should have been easy to confirm or dismiss. If it was only a maintenance corridor, why did someone build a room inside it that didn't need to exist? And why did the most specific detail about it stop being mentioned at all? The first person to go back in wasn't a historian. He was a West Berlin maintenance foreman in the late 1960s, sent to inspect a sagging service tunnel after a minor street collapse. Behind a bricked-up recess, newer mortar, cleaner lines, his crew found a narrow void, and inside it a tangle of hardware that didn't belong to pipes or power. There were lengths of thick copper bus bar cut clean as if by a shop shear, ceramic insulators the size of a man's fist, each stamped with a code and a tiny eagle that had been ground down but not fully erased. A pressure gauge with a face marked in atmospheres, its glass crazed, the needle frozen far above normal ventilation range, and bolted to a concrete plinth half buried in silt. Compact steel housing with 3 shielded cable glands, no labels, no unit plate, only a faint ring where a tag had once been riveted. Nearby, the wall carried a rectangle of paint that was newer than everything around it, as if someone had tried to hide where something had been removed. None of it fit the site's official function. Utility corridors use standard conduit and accessible junction boxes, not heavy copper bars meant for sustained load. Ventilation systems needed dampers and fans, not sealed housings with shielded glands. The gauge's range made no sense for moving air. It suggested pressure work, sealed lines, controlled flow, something you would expect in an industrial plant, not a service passage under a ruined capital. Then the contradictions began to stack, small but sharp. A Soviet inventory list from 1945 marks no technical apparatus remaining. Yet an East German municipal note from 1952 refers to decommissioning electrical elements at the same coordinates. The foreman's log describes fresh mortar that could not have been poured in 1945 if the entrance had been cleared. And a later public brochure about post-war repairs in the area claims the corridor was inaccessible until modernization, even though the maintenance crew entered it with a key from a city office. By that point, it becomes hard to pretend the odd pieces are random leftovers. In that period, there were programs known only to a handful of officers and engineers, work that never appeared in public construction records, tasks buried under harmless titles. A few archived references hint that this underground space may have served more than one purpose, depending on who controlled it and when. If the corridor was truly empty, why did the documents keep tripping over one another? And if the equipment was meaningless, why does every trail lead to someone quietly sealing, removing, and rephrasing it instead of simply reporting it? Once the fragments are placed side by side, staying inside the official story becomes difficult. Researchers who tried to reconcile the inventories, repair logs, and eyewitness notes found that the corridor only made sense if its stated purpose was incomplete. This was not a leap toward sensation, but a concession to arithmetic. The parts, the dates, and the silences refuse to align otherwise. The gaps are consistent. Several documents cite annexes that are no longer attached. A Soviet technical summary references supplementary diagrams, yet no archive lists them as destroyed or transferred. In Western records from the same decade, the names of two electrical specialists appear once and then vanish entirely. No later postings, no retirement files, no deaths recorded in open registries. The absence of data begins to look patterned. In places like this, missing information can weigh as much as preserved pages. A handful of testimonies sit in that uneasy space between presence and denial. One former engineer interviewed in the 1980s recalled night work beneath the spree where entry logs were handwritten and never copied. He described rooms without signage and equipment already powered when crews arrived. A private diary later donated by a family who did not know its relevance mentions sealed lines under the city and instructions never to ask what fed them. None of these accounts were disproven. They were simply left outside the frame. From this, several restrained theories emerge. One suggests the site supported controlled pressure experiments tied to late-war energy distribution, explaining the copper bus bars and abnormal gauges. Another proposes a post-surrender repurposing, a temporary testing ground used by occupying forces before being stripped, accounting for the mismatched dates and fresh mortar. A third considers the corridor a junction, never a destination itself, built to host equipment meant to be installed, evaluated, and removed without leaving a trace. Each theory fits the technology of the time. Each answers some questions. None were ever adopted officially, perhaps because acknowledging them would require admitting the corridor was never as empty as claimed. Descriptions of the deeper sections reinforce that restraint. Narrow stairs drop below the map level. Doors open onto unmarked technical rooms where cable trays end abruptly. Former workers spoke of nights when sections were lit without explanation, when access was granted and revoked within hours. It was a controlled environment, measured and watched, where movement mattered. If even one of these explanations approaches the truth, then something had to happen after the war, something deliberate to make the corridor appear so ordinary again. And whatever that was, it left fewer records than the work that came before it. What followed was not a gradual fading, but a decision. In the early 1950s, the corridor was altered with unusual speed. Access points were narrowed, then sealed. One stairwell was cut off below the map level and filled with aggregate. Sections closest to the river were deliberately flooded, not by neglect, but by open valves that never appeared on civilian schematics. The site was neither preserved nor publicly dismantled. It was neutralized, rendered unusable, and filed away under routine maintenance language that explained nothing. What vanished is easier to list than to trace. The heavy copper elements noted by the maintenance crew were gone within a year. The ceramic-faced door assembly described in the Allied report no longer appeared on inspection routes. Entire technical rooms, measurable on early plans, were missing from later diagrams, as if the walls themselves had been edited. No transfer orders survive, no disposal records. In subsequent summaries, these components are treated as if they had never been present at all. Decades later, a small detail resurfaced in the 1990s during digitization of municipal archives. A mislabeled photograph was found in a batch of unrelated infrastructure images. It shows a concrete corridor under construction, date stamped after the war, with 3 shielded cables disappearing through a wall into a space outside the frame. The wall surface matches the repainting described by the foreman years earlier. The image was cataloged, not analyzed, and did not alter the accepted history. It remains an orphaned record, acknowledged but unexplained. Officially, the story's simple. The corridor was a wartime utility space, damaged, inspected, and closed for safety. Nothing of consequence was ever documented there. Yet that version leaves basic questions unanswered. Why the rapid post-war alterations? Why the selective removal? Why the silence around features that appeared briefly and then dissolved from the record? The files end without conclusion. The place remains beneath the city, inaccessible and inert. Perhaps the most important elements were never recovered, or perhaps they were, and ensuring they could not be found again was the final task carried out underground. The history stops where certainty would have begun.